Hello, and a warm welcome to Radio 1. And not only a warm welcome, but a sincere and genuine welcome and introduction to a subject which I hope is going to be intriguing, interesting, arresting, informative, knowledgeable, and is motivational and inspiring. Because if you undertake the journey with me as we traipse down the road of radio to our destination, this journey is adventurous, exciting, sometimes mysterious, magical, often problematic, frustrating, but ultimately it is a worthwhile endeavor because it speaks to the magic that is derived from the theater of the mind. And that is what radio is referred to in the industry. I know sometimes it's considered to be a cliched and anachronistic interpretation of what radio is, but it still has validity today. It is the theater of the mind. Why? Because it obliges the listener to use some form of rationalization in listening to what they're hearing, to employ their imagination to visualize that which they are hearing. And each one of us, in our own way, imagines and visualizes in a different way. So that of the 7.7 billion people on God's mortal coil, no single person interprets that which they hear in exactly the same fashion as another. And therein lies the magic and the beauty of radio. It is a personal, intimate medium. It is correspondence on a one-to-one basis. And it is person to person. And it must be so, because that is what distinguishes radio from other media forms, is its personal, emotive, individual, singular personality. Okay? I am speaking to you as I would speak to you over the radio. I am not lecturing. I am not speaking at you. I am speaking to you. I am trying to communicate with you. And in essence, as a nascent media practitioner, you should understand that in general, the media is nothing other than the art of communication. And in radio, you employ the mouth at the one end and the ears at the other end to conduct the transfer of information that is entertaining, educating, and informative. And in that way, radio stations establish a relationship with the listener as would a friend, a colleague, associate, or a confidant. I am not delivering a sermon from the mount. I'm not standing behind the podium or on the podium behind a lectern and lecturing down to you. I have not cantilevered my presentation in such a way that I am trying to patronize you or I'm trying to come across as being that which is superior. I'm trying to establish correspondence on an equality-based, democratic, and unfiltered relationship, which is not subject to class divisions or discrimination. So bearing that in mind, I again welcome you to Radio 1 and hope that you can hear that I'm speaking to you in the way that you can feel radio. And that is one of the major features and components of radio, which makes it distinct from other media forms. So, a little introduction and a way of welcoming you to this particular PowerPoint presentation. Now, radio was the father of all modern day telecommunications. It was there at the start and is still here today and has survived all the challenges, the competition, and the vicissitudes of the industry and remains relevant, profitable, and has a positive and optimistic prospectus on the future. Why? Because radio is an inclusive medium. It does not try to avoid people. It tries to involve people. Okay? It treats people as a collective, as a community, by speaking through the individual. Module 1 deals with the radio landscape, and it's derived from Chapter 1. An introduction to the South African radio landscape, what it looks like, how many radio stations, how they operate, in what sectors, in what format, with what genre, and so on and so forth. The evolution of radio in South Africa, which is the story which tells of how radio started, how it started to develop both technologically and otherwise, how the radio pie became ever more dissected into more sectors and theaters of operations, and of course, the technological aspects of radio, which have revolutionized the telecommunications landscape globally. Okay, and that has happened to radio as well. Commercial radio in South Africa, we'll be talking about that sector, which is all about giving listeners what they want to hear in order to make money. Okay. Public radio in South Africa is different in the sense that public radio is almost like a civil servant. It is through legislation in Parliament that the South African government of the day is mandated with the obligation to provide all the citizenry of South Africa with a platform, a forum of discussion, information, education, entertainment, and other such correspondence, which allows every citizen of the country to take part in the South African discourse, irrespective of race, religion, creed, color, culture, or language. It is the ultimate democratic medium in that sense. And it is a compulsory service which is initiated by the government and is a responsibility of the government to conduct through the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Community radio in South Africa is obviously those smaller stations that speak specifically to communities that they've identified with their materials so that they can be of service to that particular community. Okay? And essentially, they are non-profit organizations, Section 21 companies. But there is a bit of a gray area there, and I'll be discussing it in more detail at further length in due course. Okay, let's have a look at digital radio, which is the new kid on the block, the enfant terrible, okay? The one that is now adding further luster, scope, expertise, and of course, potential to traditional radio. Because what has happened over the last couple of years is that radio is now a multimedia platform in the sense that with the advent of digital radio and the old radio, which is called linear radio, which is speaking to a listener over the microphone, you now have the digital component, which allows radio to be present in many more areas, spaces, portals, and sites, and have its brand, okay, and have its message proselytized on those sites and those portals and other places in the digital paradigm, which has allowed radio to become even more complex, but even more accessible in many more areas to many more people, and offering people different radio experiences as well. Not every listener wants to listen to the same radio experience. And one of the advantages of the addition of digital radio to linear radio has been the fact that it's opened up so many new possibilities and opportunities for radio practitioners. Then we speak to radio outside of South Africa. We broadcast to other countries on the continent and elsewhere, and that is also part and parcel of the SABC's obligations. Module 2 looks at the radio professional, where you, as a nascent radio media practitioner, inculcate and adopt all those best method practices which can form you as a radio professional, a person who is representative of that description. I know it's a simplistic interpretation, but to become a radio professional, you have to inculcate yourself and adopt the knowing, being, and doing of being that persona with the best prospects of gaining traction in the marketplace. And this involves your personality, your attitude, what you learn, what you know, your innate skill sets and talents, and how you can brand yourself and provide the marketplace with a discernible commodity that can add value and marginal utility. Okay? More about that as we discuss this particular section, which is contained in Chapter 14. Academic preparation, that speaks for itself, obviously. The body of work speaks to the audio portfolio, which will be your audio demo, which will display your vocal skills and your ability to address an audience over the microphone. It is a recorded item, okay? And I'll be telling you more about that. And it gives evidence of what you're capable of doing. So when approaching a prospective employer, this audio portfolio can be listened to, and the employer can recognize the talent, if there is talent to be heard, and make a decision accordingly. Included in the body of work, other than the audio portfolio, will be the digital profile. Your digital profile is very crucial and critical to your development as a radio practitioner. I'll tell you why, because you need to establish a presence in the marketplace. And the easiest way of doing so is to establish yourself on the digital portals through means of a podcast or a blog or whatever the case might be, okay? But preferably a podcast. Those would be talking radio here, of course. A digital profile allows you to start right away today at this very instant to establish yourself, your brand, your identity, your material, okay, your programming, and your content, which is stylized, customized, curated and cultivated to suit you and your potential listener, okay? And the more you practice this methodology, the more chances avail themselves to you, and the more chances you have or opportunities are being recognized, appreciated, validated, and made proper use of, okay? And then your career can start gaining trajectory. You can put the rubber on the road, get direction, undertake the journey with the knowledge that there is a destination, and that destination is worthwhile. An experience log. Now here's the modern day conundrum. Every employer wants somebody with experience, but how do you apply for that job if you have none? Okay, it's almost oxymoronic, not so. I'm looking for experience, but I don't have. But I certainly have the skills and the talent to be able to do so. Yes, but I'm looking for experience. You know, that is the average rejoinder and or response to somebody who has none. I'll be giving you some insights as how to circumvent and deal with that kind of problem as well. Volunteering is part and parcel of the industry in this sense. You've got to be proactive. You've got to give to get in this industry. And by volunteering, you are able to lend your services to a particular enterprise or entity, a radio station, and then you can be recognized. And if you're recognized by the right person, in the right place, at the right time, then your work is more than halfway done. Because then people who are prepared to give you advice, guidance, and author your career in a certain way can become your mentor, okay? And advise you in such a way that you can avoid all the pitfalls of the industry, but also how to deal with the industry in such a way that, and I hate to use this word, but that you can manipulate it to your advantage and to not disadvantage. It's wonderful to have a senior with a lot of experience in scar tissue in the industry to be able to give you appropriate advice when needed and point you in the right direction. And that also involves networking and relationships. It's a sine qua non for this industry. You've got to love people. You must have a social IQ and social skills. And that says that you need to get up out of your chair and get into the mix, into the pool, so to speak, and start swimming and building those contacts, those go-to people, those critical places, those critical numbers, and other crucial, okay, points of connection where you can be availed of an opportunity, where somebody that you know can roll a stone out of the road for you, or provide you with another person who is worthy of advice, or point you to perhaps an audition, or give you some other advice as to what you should do in order to expedite your career, okay? And once again, if you're in the right place at the right time and you meet the right person, your job is more than half done, in the sense that if you have the skill sets and the talent, you just need the opportunity. And most opportunities, my good friend, are to be found when you are networking and building relationships, not only with your listeners, but with your colleagues, associates, friends, and confidants within the industry as well, okay? And this covers the whole gamut of the media experience. You need not only know people in radio, but it's good to know people in television and other disciplines as well, so that you can build up a little black book or a go-to reference of all of those numbers, contacts, and special people and places that you can make use of to make your career as successful and as profitable as you possibly can. Module 3 deals with programming, where it's all about that which you provide as content in your broadcasting to a niche-focused audience, a la a demographic, okay? So you've got to preach to the converted in radio. It's no use trying to impart information to an audience that doesn't want to hear it, okay? But it is in programming that you adopt this kind of strategy where you give the listener what they want with the content of the programming and the scheduling. And in so doing, you achieve a certain consistency, a certain quality, and of course, a certain outcome, which is predictable. Lessons 7 to 14, have a look at chapter 3, and then ask yourself what constitutes radio programming, having read that, okay? And look at the formats, music, speech, and digital, okay? Music, of course, speaks for itself, speech speaks for itself, but digital is a little more complicated because there are many aspects to it. Radio today is known as a multi-platform media exercise because, as I previously told you, it conflates the linear and the new digital aspect of radio and uses them to breathe in syncopation, to correspond, to corroborate, to cooperate together. And in so doing, it spreads its gospel much more widely to many more sites and many more people than was previously the case. So radio is now reaching areas it never reached before. And this is adding to the capital of radio in the 21st century and the modern day. It goes without saying that informative and entertaining content must be on the menu, because if it's not, nobody's going to listen to it. Module 4 is about creating content. And as with everything in life, it's not so much about the look of the thing, but the substance of it, okay? And in Module 4, we teach you how to create content which is compelling, arresting, interesting, informative, and anything else for that matter which pleases the listener to the extent that it increases the listenership and creates that kind of listenership which turns into a fan base with the extra component of loyalty, okay? Obviously, you are going to cut your cloth according to your build. In conforming the content for your radio station, you are going to speak to an audience with the contents of your programming which suits their lifestyle, tastes, desires, hopes, dreams, and wishes, okay? So if you're speaking to a less mature demographic, say a contemporary hit radio demographic of 16 to 25, okay, you will be speaking the kind of content to them which is of interest and pertinence to them. Whereas when you're speaking to an adult contemporary audience ranging from the age of 25 to 54, obviously being maturer, they have a different take on what they find to be content rich and content worthy. So it's all about creating content which can be niche focused at a particular demographic or a particular market. We provide an introduction to radio content, voice and performance. And I just might tell you here, without going into too much detail, that it is not the voice which is the clincher at the end of the day. There are two types of voices which I will go into further description about, an active and a passive voice. But at the end of the day, it is what you say that is important. It is not the sound of your voice per se, which is the most important thing. It is what you say to that listener. So the quality of your voice is important for certain aspects of broadcasting, okay? That goes without saying. But you need not necessarily have the golden voice to be able to acquit yourself adequately on radio. Clocks informatics refers to the technical preparation for a radio and the schematics and the graphics that are used as points of reference to know where you are at any given time on the schedule. Show preparation also speaks for itself. You prepare for every show, every day. And remember that radio never sleeps. It's a 24/7 enterprise, 365 days a year. Call it what you will. Give it as many days as you want. Radio is always on the job. And it is always predicated on time. It needs to be punctual. So taking these aspects into consideration, you should realize and appreciate that preparing for a show is paramount. Features. Those are those little items which add luster and pop and texture to your programming and content. They can be anything which range from interviews to pop culture, celebrity gossip, sports reportage, and anything else for that matter, which is part and parcel of interrupting your programming in the nicest possible way every now and again with a feature which adds further stickiness and attraction to your presentation. Interactions. Of course, you're going to be interacting with people. This is the nature of the media, not only with your audience or your listener, but with your colleagues at the radio station, in studio staff, those behind the scenes, and generally those people in the industry. So once again, it points to you being sociable and having social skills whereby you can interact with people in a positive way. Storytelling. Radio, in a way, is all about storytelling. Every time you speak to your listener, in a way, you are providing them with some form of information, even if it's a time check. And that sounds simplistic, but even in that way, you're telling a little story. And it's how you tell the story which is important, okay? And while I'm here, let me just tell you that there's nothing per se boring about any particular topic, but the way or the angle in which you approach that topic. It's all about perception. And the same applies to storytelling. And let me tell you, my good friend, if you can tell a good story on radio, according to radio prescriptions, okay, then you are a commodity. You are worthwhile. Outside broadcasts speak to those broadcasts that take place externally at a different venue, locale, location, or site. At a sporting venue, at a concert, a political gathering that's taking place outside of the studio, and how that happens, how it's put together, and how that signal is relayed from the event which is taking place back to the studio, and then again transmitted to the listener at home. Specialist shows. Those shows stand apart from the normal programming because it allows the expert on a particular subject to cultivate a show for those people over and above the normal listener to the radio station, but others that are listening to the radio station as regulars at times when the radio station's listenership wanes. Like after the drive session, for instance, when listeners get home and they're preparing supper or watching telly or whatever the case might be, programmers and producers use specialist shows to plump up those duller patches during the scheduling on a day's broadcast. And those specialist shows attract an audience because of the expertise of the presenter, who knows pretty much everything about the subject that he is presenting. Okay, more about that later as well. And many specialist shows are nothing other than hand-curated works of art. Your go-to lodestone, your mothership of information, is contained in the repository or textbook Next Level Radio, compiled by Jane Cullinan and Grant Nash. And I might just say that it is an excellent textbook. You are fortunate to have a textbook which is a cornucopia of radio knowledge, information, insights, techniques, applications, protocols, and principles. It is comprehensive, it is logical, it is easily understandable and referenceable, and also applicable as well. All right, it is practical. So you cannot complain about your go-to textbook. It pretty much runs the gamut of radio from A to Z. Chapter 1, 1.1, deals with the introduction on page 2. 1.2 deals with the evolution of South African radio, pages 3 to 20. Now, when we evaluate your suitability, okay, there are 2 assessments, but actually 4. Now, that sounds contradictory, but let me explain. 2 semesters, A and B, and in each semester we have 2 evaluations or assessments, a formative assessment and a summative assessment, okay, for the 1 semester. The formative assessment, the FA1, is worth 40% of your year mark. If you fail that, you're allowed to write a supplementary if your marks are between 30 and 49, all right? In the second half of your semester, you do the SA1, which is your summative assessment, which is worth 60% of your year mark. So if you're not particularly happy or impressed with your first effort, which counts for 40% of your year mark, you can reconcile your average with the summative assessment because it's worth 60% of your mark. Also, as with the FA1, if you fail the summative, you have the opportunity to do the supplementary exam as well. Radio started broadcasting in the 1900s, okay? And the first broadcast in South Africa was in December 1923. The government issued 3 radio licenses in Johannesburg, the first station in South Africa, Cape Town and Durban. And in South Africa, at a stage, there was this need for an official broadcasting entity. So they started the African Broadcast Corporation in 1927. And it lasted until 1936, but was closed due to financial constraints. And thereafter, in Commissioner Street in Johannesburg in 1936, the South African Broadcasting Corporation was established. And that was the beginning of our very own South African go-to governmental radio station. And in 1943, the government itself and the SABC decided to open Zulu, Xhosa, and Sotho radio services as well. Why I say that is because when you look at page 1 on chapter 1.1 and this particular montage, this visual montage, the first impression that you should gather is that we are a very diverse nation. It's a wonderful thing. We originate from many different cultures, languages, tribes, traditions, communities, areas, histories, but we all share a singular South African experience, okay? Because we live in the country, of course. But when you look at these visuals, you can almost immediately appreciate that it is not an easy task to broadcast to 9 provinces in 11 languages. And this visual should drive home this point. We have a country which is kaleidoscopic and chameleonesque. And it also runs the gamut from A to Z. And we are lucky enough to have such a multi-diverse population in this country. But the obligation on radio stations is even more burdensome in the sense that they've got to address the interests, concerns, and welfare of all of the citizenry of South Africa in whatsoever capacity that they can. There are many well-heeled stations which speak to financially well-endowed people. Their market is different to a market which speaks to a village community or a township, or those which are considered to be less economically privileged. And this is not meant to be deprecating, but it is just once again a reminder that we have a very complex country with many languages, many cultures, and many different kinds of people with different perceptions and attitudes. And in that way, we try to address all of their demands. Radio stations in South Africa, format and sector, just to give you an indication. Metro FM, its format, and let me give you the official definition of a format. A format is a schedule designed to inform, educate, and entertain a niche-focused demographic with the consistency of its programming. So that when you tune into any frequency, you almost immediately recognize the radio station because of the feel, the sound, the brand of the radio station that you've come to know. The announcer need not identify the station, okay? So in other words, it is something that you immediately relate to in terms of its consistency of sound and the fact that that particular sound is the kind of sound that you associate with the radio station that you're listening to. Metro FM is an AC station, adult contemporary station, also called urban. It deals with a demographic of 25 to 54 and works within the public commercial sector, okay? Public commercial sector. And those are the commercial stations that belong to the SABC. Ukosi FM, the ubiquitous champion of the airwaves, which is the biggest radio station in the country and one of the top 3 radio stations by listenership in the world, is an all-service radio station by format, which means that anything that can happen on radio happens on the radio station. Enough said. Lotus FM is more specific. It has full service. It encompasses all the techniques and mechanisms and programming of radio, but is directed at a particular culture. And in this instance, the Indian community. We also have High FM, which deals with the Jewish community, Radio Islam with the Muslim community. And we also have the outlier called Classic FM, which doesn't serve a particular community, but serves the interests and love of classical music aficionados. It also operates in the public broadcasting sector. Impact Radio is a community radio station. And once again, community radio stations are largely much smaller and address a smaller community with community stuff. 702, as you well know, is a commercial radio station predicated on making money. It works in that sector. It is a speech-based format. It deals with talk radio, and we know it well enough by now. Look at that radio studio back in 1948. Steam radio at its best. What looks like a turntable there, and other equipment which looks very primitive. And this man is currently dealing with a telephone hybrid, okay? That looks like something from the Jetsons, and the old telephone receiver stroke transmitter in his hand. And he's obviously taking a call or making a call. Hopefully there's a microphone in the vicinity. That's how primitive radio was in its infancy. There's a mixing console from 1930 to 1960, just to give you the weather-beaten look of something that has been well used. Broadcast mic from 46 to 49. A modern studio, so it says in 1960, this is when radio started to become trendy, modern, funky, cutting edge, and you can see the technological development kept abreast of that impression. There are 2 turntables that look a little more operable. I don't see a microphone, strangely enough. That could quite well be one, but that's a hybrid. You can see there's some cabling patches over there, and there's a monitor in front of him. I would not know how that works, and I don't think anybody living today knows how that works. But anyway, it just shows you how basic and how grasping the first technological innovations were for radio. But it worked. It still broadcasts, not necessarily in the way that you hear radio today, but you did hear some sound, interrupted by static occasionally or a thunderstorm. But that was what radio studios looked like in the 60s. When music started changing, the top 40 format was established, and we were about to go into the summer of love, the age of the beatniks and the hippies. There's a radio studio post-1960, and I can see how technology had advanced already. There's some cart racks. There's some cassette racks there, a microphone which looks a little more modern, and some other equipment which looks a little more specified, okay? Now, after 2000, what happened? Radio really started developing. Here's an example of the optimum radio studio. I'm not saying it's the best. I'm just saying have a look at it. You can just see it's the business, okay? Fully digitalized. Everything here is digitalized, okay? No longer the linear action, okay? Yes, he's speaking to the listener, but everything is run by the computer. All the radio programming is contained in the computer. The music, the elements, the features, and anything else that needs to be done on radio is contained and triggered off the computer. Okay? So when radio was faced with all the challenges that it had to undergo through the decades to survive and prosper, television was its first competitor. And ironic to see television monitor and the television itself running radio today, because radio has this habit of absorbing and embracing competition and adapting it to the suitability of radio and then using it to enhance the product of radio, as it has so successfully done over the years. Have a look at the rest of the decor. It is all top-notch, cutting edge, and creates a favorable impression, and of course adds to the branding and image of the station. 2 decent monitors, digital clock, okay, and of course much less equipment in the studio than one would ordinarily expect, because everything is digitally driven these days. Obviously there's an interview or a chat show taking place here, and here's the presenter eliciting the response of one of the interviewees. What is also nice to see is that in these modern day studios, you have this plate glass window through which you can maintain visual contact with the off-air staff, or perhaps an engineer or somebody else that you'd like to communicate with. But once again, strange to see that radio has adopted television, and it's now indistinguishable from the modern day radio studio and broadcast. Kaya FM has a suitably sophisticated studio. You can see there, less equipment, digitized as well. Also a very commodious and very attractive studio. Joyous Radio, also digitized. That's one of the Christian radio stations. And then our DJs, our modern day DJs. These are the people who have done some introspection. They've done some self-examination. They looked in the mirror and asked themselves, who am I? What are my strong suits? What are those innate talents and skills and propensities and properties that I'm born with, either through genetic inheritance or God-given or otherwise? And once you've identified those strong suits, the cards that you can play of the hand that has been dealt you, the strong suit, then you can start developing that attribute in such a way that it becomes your brand, your license, your passport, your ticket to pleasure. It becomes the optic through which the viewer, the listener, or any other follower or fan views you as a person. It is that brand and image that you've carefully cultivated, curated, and conformed to suit your personality. Not by emulating somebody else or copying somebody else and becoming a reasonable facsimile of somebody else, but by being yourself, but the best that you can be. Anele, what a personality. Loud and proud and colorful and personal, and in your face and enjoyable. Established herself as a major radio personality. She is a true radio person in the sense that she's a communicator on radio. I prefer to see her or hear her on radio than perhaps on the screen. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. But here is somebody who plays every portal and every space that he possibly can, because he's capitalized on his brand and he individually has achieved great success because he's multi-skilled, has crossover appeal, as they say in modern terminology. So Somizi is not only an actor, a television personality, an author. He's brought out dance videos. He's accessed every commercial space and media space that he possibly can. He's spread himself very thin, but he's done so in a way because he has branded himself and made himself an added value commodity to the marketplace, and is doing very well. Here's one of the rebels of radio, but also a respected and very talented radio man who's established himself because he is the guy who plays the straight guy, if you know what I mean. And this is not anything other than being your direct radio personality who, in being himself, can impose himself on some people, can annoy some people, can disturb the relative complacency of some people, but he's always knowledgeable, intelligent, and communicable. Okay? His name is Gareth Cliff, and he is probably South Africa's only shock jock, and I say it in the sense of shock jock light. But he also brings a lot of other skills to bear. And he started the only digital radio station a couple of years ago, which is able to be listened to in the country, cliffcentral.com. So I'm sure you're aware of these three personalities. But why I put these pictures here is they each in turn reflect a certain brand and identity. He's real. He's real. She's real. Because they're being the best that they can be, because they have done some introspection and ventilated and developed those skills that they have innately. Licensed stations, chapter 1.2. Of course, we have commercial, public radio, and community radio stations. And the governor of the landscape, the umbrella organization, which sees to it that everybody is behaving according to the script and reading off the same page and obeying the protocols, principles, and rules, and the issuer of favors and condonations, and most importantly, radio and television licenses, is ICASA, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa. That is the regulatory body which overlooks and oversees the media industry. Appointed by the government, it regulates and controls all broadcasting in South Africa. It issues radio and television licenses, the most expensive aspect of starting a radio station in the traditional sense, just info there. And you'll be interested to know that it regulates all communications on air in South Africa. And that includes cell phones, all the networks, telecom, satellite, police, sea, air, and land radios and communication devices, and any other device which is capable of communication for that matter. And it also is tasked with developing and updating new rules and regulations. And just yesterday, I heard a High Court ruling which ruled against ICASA in favor of ETV and Telkom, who launched an interdict into the auction of the radio frequency spectrum, which better described is the migration from the old analog system to the digital system. And it is quite an enterprise to be able to do so. It's not difficult to do so, but there are so many stakeholders and others who want to have their snouts in the trough and their fingers in the pie that it is turned into quite an imbroglio, to the point where ETV and Telkom took ICASA to the High Court, and the High Court has recently interdicted ICASA from allowing the auction of the spectrum of digital licenses to be sold to the highest bidder, but to the exclusion of ETV and Telkom. So much money is involved in this that there's going to be many more problems and complications that I foresee. And at the moment, it's in a state of stasis and controversy, and I don't see it being resolved very soon. But for all of us media practitioners, the sooner the better. Once again, the four sectors of radio stations. Private, those are the commercial stations. SABC owns the public stations. The community radios are non-profit organizations, and the digital radio spectrum is broadly described by internet radio. All radio stations naturally are a business, okay? So that involves consumers and customers. And our consumers in this instance on radio are the listeners. Our customers or clients on radio are our advertisers, sponsors, marketers, donors, and other partners that bring money to the station, without which the station cannot survive. Stakeholders, in the case of state-owned enterprises, and usually it's jobs for pals there, without being too ironic. But in the case of private or commercially owned radio stations, you have stakeholders that are owners in their own right. There are a couple of owners, privateers, an entity, a board, an executive, or perhaps a trust fund. Who knows? But they are commercially driven. And while I'm on this subject, you're probably thinking to yourself, now I've heard what you've had to say. Why would I even think of starting a radio station in 2020 when I know if I had to approach ICASA for a license and frequency, that it is beyond my reach and capability? Why would I then even think of starting a station in 2020? What am I to do? I would suggest you watch this link that I've co-opted from YouTube, Why Start a Radio Station in 2020? And I'm sure there are some valuable insights to be gleaned there. And while I'm about it, if you're going to start now. Establish a digital presence. Start practicing developing a podcast which you are familiar with, sufficiently familiar with that you are knowledgeable, okay? And you're not cringeworthy. But you build up an audience. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and by word of mouth, and because of the excellence of your material and your programming and your content, okay, and the way that you deliver it, you start building a fan base and attract money to your podcast or your digital exercise. And then people start taking an interest in you as an individual. You become that commodity, that added value item that they're looking for. And as I said earlier, all radio stations essentially are a business, even those community ones, okay, must deliver profit. No listeners, no advertisers, no money, no radio, no job. It happened to the SABC. It spent so much money on Henley Towers that it got into trouble. So in 1996, through deregulation and liberalization, the government withdrew and relaxed a number of broadcast rules and opened the airways for other shareholders other than the SABC, and for only 500 million rand in 1996. I know it sounds like a lot of money, but just think of the radio stations that were sold. 94.7 Highvale Stereo, Jacaranda, East Coast, KFM, OFM, and it's done quite well. To say nothing of that little radio station in the Free State. We'll be talking about that as well. I've also got this off the internet, according to Business Tech, currently, and there's always dispute and controversy about who's top dog, but according to Business Tech, these are the 20 most popular radio stations in South Africa. There you can see Nkosi, Flobo, Wenene, Metro, Lesedi, Tobela, Motsubeding, Kakasi, RSG, Jacaranda. That's the first English-speaking station, huh? And it's actually English and Afrikaans. The rest of them, until East Coast Radio, are all indigenous languages. What does that tell you? You don't have to be a master of English. You have to be competent in that language because it's the international lingua franca. But at the same time, if you're good in your own language, check that out. Do the math, okay? KFM's not doing badly. It's a largely Cape-based station. It's enjoying more listenership currently than 94.7. So this particular list says. But ladies, gentlemen, you, I shouldn't refer to you in the plural, but what you understand me to be communicating to you is that statistics are nothing more than lies, more lies and damned lies, okay? I'm very wary of interpreting statistics as given to me. Rather do your own research sometimes when you're looking at the math and trying to discern which radio station is prevailing and or not. Fortunately, we have the Broadcast Research Council RAM survey, which is brought out every quarterly, which is the accurate barometer of the South African radio landscape and allows you, as is evinced by this slide, to on a quarterly basis Evaluate the radio landscape in percentages, listenership, listeners lost, listeners gained, okay, and the total listenership figures for a particular radio station, all right? And the Broadcast Research Council Radio Audience Measurement System, please remember this, is the go-to repository of statistical analysis of the South African radio landscape. It's the Bible of statistics, which is used slavishly to describe the success or not of any radio station in the country. Here, just a pictorial of the 8 commercial licenses that were granted by ICASA. Heart FM, Cape Talk, Kai FM, YFM, Classic 102.7, and Kakasi in Durban. And of course, we know that they haven't done too badly, have they? The media environment in the commercial sense is largely monopolized and governed by 3 media conglomerates or corporates. They are Kagiso Media, who own Jacaranda 94.2 and East Coast Radio. Prime Media oversees 702, 94.7 and Cape Talk, and African Media Entertainment, Classic FM, Algoa, and OFM. Okay? So it shows you how small the pool is and to what extent that small pool is governed by some big sharks. Okay? And I'm saying it in the amusing sense. Public radio, page 7. At the SABC, there are 15 public broadcasters and 3 public commercial services. There they are, okay? 70% of the funding comes from advertising revenue. And I see now that MultiChoice and the SABC have agreed that it's a good thing to tax we, the tax-paying public, a levy or a fee for having any communications device in the house, like television for that matter. Even if you don't watch that particular channel or that particular organization's programming, MultiChoice has now literally agreed with the SABC that at some given time, it seems we are going to have to pay some kind of levy or tax on the communications devices we have in our house. So I'm not going to say more about that other than to say, obviously, somebody needs some money somewhere. The SABC is government owned, that's obvious, and the board and top management is appointed by the government. Now, some homework for you. Read example 1A, page 7, and complete activity 1A, question 1, 2, and 3, page 15, okay? Public radio stations. I told you what they're there for. There are the conditions that they are obliged to operate under. They need to have 150 minutes of drama per week, 240 to 300 minutes of educational content per week, some religious content, and some sports coverage. And these are the relevant radio stations: Ikwekwezi, Ligwalagwala, Lotus, Lesedi, Ugano Loneni, Motsweding, Palapala, Radio 2000, Addis here, SAFM, and Tobela FM. That's the language in which they broadcast. And once again, you know, the format is the brand, the sound, and the feel of the station. Full service cultural stations other than True FM, which is focused on the youth. Full service, once again, okay, when it is combined with the cultural aspect, means that they're speaking in the language that that radio station propagates, but provides a full service of radio ingredients or material, okay? Anything, soapies, pop charts, interviews, discussions, debates, music, anything that you can put on radio. The conditions of format for public commercial services, they must provide at least 60 minutes of news per day, because they have to provide the citizens or their listeners with current affairs and what's happening in and around them in the world, in their towns, villages, communities at large. Examples thereof: Metro FM in English, Urban Contemporary, also known as Adult Contemporary, 25 to 54 demographic; 5FM English, Contemporary Hit Radio, kind of top 40 format. We know it as CHR, Contemporary Hit Radio, demographic 16 to 25. Good Hope FM, bilingual, also a CHR radio. And it's kind of, pretty much run-of-the-mill stuff. But that's the format that seems to work for it. Then we were talking about externalities, broadcasts beyond the borders of our country. And there we deal with Channel Africa, which is an SABC entity. It's multinational, broadcasts internationally, supports South Africa's foreign policy, is available on shortwave, satellite and internet, and has a very large footprint. A footprint is that geographical area covered by the strength of a station's transmitter. Okay, the larger the footprint, the more potential listeners you have within that field described by the footprint, the strength of the transmitter. The smaller the footprint, the less listeners within that locality. But you can see this is a big footprint because it encompasses sub-Saharan Africa right up to London. Community radio, where you'll probably start your career because it's the most easy station to get into, to put it plainly. Page 12, have a look at it. But it's nothing to be embarrassed about. There's nothing wrong with community stations. By being there, you can pick up so much experience, okay? You can learn the ropes. You can add skills to your skill set. You can learn new things. You can become comfortable with operating within the sphere of radio. And you can build up experience and possibly get a testimonial and some form of validation. These community radio station licenses were first issued by ICASA in 94-95. And in short, it's got to address the needs of all cultural and language groups in the country, okay? There are presently plus minus 260 community stations in South Africa. And of course, they target a specific community, people, culture, and or groups. All right, they try to cultivate loyal listeners. In many instances, they do have, but weak transmitters, small footprint, big competitors, SABC and the other three media giants means less listeners, less ads, and financial challenges. And it's largely dependent on funding, donors, and other such donations to keep its head above water. But admirably, community radio in South Africa battles on and survives to face another day. I hope you enjoyed the first PowerPoint presentation. And once again, I welcome you on board. A bit of self-study and homework to do. Complete activity 1A, read page 15, questions 1, 2, and 3. And that's the size of it for our first PowerPoint presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time. Look forward to chatting to you again.